Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we turn inward toward one of the oldest and quietest questions a human being can ask. A question so familiar that most people rarely pause long enough to consider it. The question of what the self actually is. Who is the one thinking these thoughts? Who is the one listening? Who is the one drifting now towards sleep? For thousands of years, philosophers, mystics, scientists, and ordinary people have wondered about the nature of the self. Some have written long books trying to define it. Others have meditated for decades searching for it. Still, others have concluded that the self may not be exactly what it first appears to be. Most of us live our entire lives without examining this question carefully. We say I and me countless times each day, without considering what those words really refer to. The self feels obvious. It feels like the most familiar thing in the world. And yet, when examined closely, it begins to dissolve into something stranger, softer, and far more interesting than the simple, solid thing it first appeared to be. Tonight, we wander slowly through the many ways thinkers have tried to understand the self through ancient temples and modern laboratories, through dreams and mirrors and quiet rooms, through childhood memories and the steady hum of the brain. The goal is not to arrive at any single answer. The goal is simply to walk with the question for a while, letting it soften, letting it open, letting it become a place to rest the mind. Perhaps the most natural place to begin is with the body, because for many people, the self first feels like something located inside a body. You are here, your hands are here, your face is here. When you wake in the morning, you find yourself still in the same body you went to sleep in. The body feels continuous, familiar, yours. But the body is also constantly changing. Every cell in the human body is part of an ongoing process of replacement. The lining of the stomach renews itself within a matter of days. Skin cells fall away and are replaced continuously. Red blood cells live for around 4 months before being recycled. Even bones, which seem so solid and permanent, slowly rebuild themselves over years. There is an old philosophical puzzle, sometimes called the Ship of Theseus. It asks a simple question. If a wooden ship has its planks replaced one by one over many years until eventually no original wood remains, is it still the same ship? And if not, when did it stop being the same? Was it after the first plank, or after half of them, or only after all of them had been replaced? Human beings face a similar puzzle. If the cells of your body are gradually being replaced throughout your life, what makes you the same person across decades? The matter that composed you as a child has largely been replaced many times over. The atoms that formed your bones, your blood, your skin in childhood have mostly been shed and renewed. And yet, you still feel like the same person. You still carry the same name. You still remember being small. So perhaps the self is not exactly the same as the body. Or perhaps the self is something more like a pattern, a shape that persists even as the material moves through it. Like a wave traveling across the surface of the ocean. The water itself does not actually travel far. The wave is a shape that moves through changing water, and human beings, in some ways, are also patterns moving slowly through changing matter. Many ancient cultures noticed this. They spoke of the body as a vessel, a temporary house, a garment worn for a while before being set down. Others described the body as a flowing river rather than a fixed structure, constantly arriving and constantly departing. The river you stand in tomorrow will not contain the same water as today, and yet you would still call it the same river beyond the body. Another candidate for the self is memory. Many people feel that what makes them who they are is the long thread of experiences they carry inside their minds, the places they have been, the people they have known, the small moments saved within them, birthdays remembered from childhood, the faces of grandparents, the taste of a meal eaten long ago, the first time they saw the ocean, the first time they fell asleep listening to rain. Memory feels like the inner archive of the self, a library only the individual has access to. Without memory, much of what we consider personal identity would seem to dissolve. People who experience certain forms of memory loss sometimes describe a feeling of disorientation, without the thread connecting yesterday to today. The present can begin to feel unanchored, and yet memory is also far less stable than people often assume. Modern psychologists have shown repeatedly that human memory is not a perfect recording of past events. It is reconstructive. Each time a memory is recalled, it is rebuilt slightly differently. Small details may shift, faces may blur, conversations may be reshaped according to what the rememberer believed afterward. This means that the self made of memories is itself constantly being rewritten. The story you tell yourself about your childhood today may not be exactly the story you told 10 years ago. Certain memories soften, others become sharper, some fade away entirely, and new ones are added continuously. The self made of memory is a slow river of remembering and forgetting, always moving, always reshaping itself in subtle ways. Even very early memories often turn out to be partly imagined. Researchers have shown that some of what we remember from very young childhood comes not from direct recollection, but from family stories told to us repeatedly, photographs we have seen, videos played back. Over time, these become woven into what feels like personal memory. The line between remembering and imagining is far thinner than most people realize. And yet, despite all this softness, memory still feels deeply personal. The familiar mental images that arrive unbidden when you cannot sleep, the voices of those who shaped you, the places you once lived, the rooms you have stood in, these memories continue forming a quiet inner landscape that feels, in many ways, like home. Another candidate for the self is personality, the collection of patterns, preferences, and reactions that make a person recognizable. The way someone laughs, the kind of weather they prefer, the foods they reach for when they are tired, the conversations they find interesting, the kinds of music that make them quiet inside. Personality often feels stable across long periods of time. Childhood friends meeting after decades sometimes say it is like no time has passed. The voice is older, the face is different, but something underneath is still recognizable, a certain humor, a certain warmth, a certain way of looking at the world. And yet, personality is also not entirely fixed. People change with age. They change after major experiences. They change because of the relationships they enter and leave. They change because of where they live, what they read, what they begin to care about, and what they slowly let go of. Personality is more like a slowly shifting pattern than a frozen sculpture. Researchers studying personality across the human lifespan have found that certain traits do remain relatively stable, but many also evolve in gentle ways over the decades. People often become slightly calmer with age, slightly more agreeable, slightly less impulsive. The self continues being recognizably itself, while also drifting slowly through subtle changes. And personality, like memory, can shift depending on the company one keeps. The version of you that emerges with a beloved old friend may carry warmth and humor that rarely appear elsewhere. The version that arrives in moments of grief may carry a tenderness that surprises even you. The self has many quiet rooms inside it. Different relationships open different doors. Different seasons of life light up different corners. Personality, in this way, is less like a fixed photograph and more like a slowly moving landscape, lit differently in every weather. Then there is the brain. In modern times, many scientists have focused on the brain as the physical seat of the self. Without the brain, there is no thinking, no perceiving, no remembering, no emotion. The brain produces the inner world that each person experiences. The colors of sunset, the taste of warm bread, the familiar voice of someone loved. The brain is also extraordinarily complex. It contains roughly 86 billion neurons, connected by trillions of synapses. Each neuron communicates with others through tiny electrical and chemical signals. Vast networks of neurons fire together in patterns that researchers are only beginning to understand. Out of this complexity, somehow, the experience of being you emerges, and yet the brain itself is not a single solid object. It is made up of many regions, each specialized for different tasks. Vision processed in one area, language in another, emotional response somewhere else, memory distributed across several systems. The sense of self that feels so unified actually arises from many separate processes working together silently in coordination. Modern neuroscience has identified something called the default mode network, a collection of brain regions that becomes active when a person is not focused on a specific task, when the mind wanders, when you think about yourself, your past, your future, The default mode network is often associated with what some scientists describe as the narrative self, the voice inside that keeps weaving the ongoing story of who you are. When this network quiets, as sometimes happens during deep meditation, certain people describe a softening of the usual sense of self. The boundary between self and world feels less sharp. The constant inner commentary slows. There is more space, more silence, more presence. The self that seemed so solid begins to feel more like a movement of thought than a fixed thing. And perhaps this is one reason many spiritual traditions have placed such importance on silent practice. Across cultures and centuries, contemplatives have noticed that long periods of quiet observation can change the way a person experiences their own selfhood, not by destroying the self, but by loosening its grip, allowing it to be held more lightly. The question of how a sense of self first develops in a human being has fascinated researchers studying childhood. Babies are not born with a clearly developed self-concept. The early months of life seem to involve a more open and undifferentiated form of experience. The infant does not yet clearly distinguish themselves from their environment or from the people caring for them. Gradually, over many months, the sense of being a separate person begins to emerge. The baby learns that their hand is their own, that when they reach, the world responds, that their cry brings a familiar face, that their body has edges, that they exist as a thing that other things relate to. One of the most famous experiments in this area is sometimes called the mirror test. Researchers gently place a small mark on a child's face, then bring them in front of a mirror. Very young children often do not recognize that the reflection is themselves. They may reach toward the mirror or treat the image as another person, but somewhere around the age of 18 months or so, many children begin to recognize the reflection. They touch their own face where the mark is, understanding that the image in the glass is them. This moment of recognition is considered an important step in the development of self-awareness. The child has begun to grasp something profound, that they are visible to themselves, that they are a being that can be seen, that they have a perspective and that others have perspectives of them. The doorway into a more complex understanding of selfhood has quietly opened. From here, the self continues developing throughout childhood and into adolescence. Children gradually develop a sense of being someone with personality, with preferences, with opinions, with a name that others use, with a story that begins to extend backward in memory, with imagined futures stretching forward. Language plays a central role in shaping the self. Once a child can speak and be spoken to, they begin internalizing the words used to describe them. Words like good, kind, smart, brave, shy, funny. The voices of parents, teachers, and peers become woven into the inner sense of who one is. The self becomes, in part, a story told to us until we begin telling it ourselves. This is why so many philosophers and psychologists have described the self as something like a narrative, a long, ongoing story that the mind composes about itself. Each day adds new sentences. Memories form the earlier chapters. Plans become the imagined future chapters. The thread that ties them together is the sense of being the same person, experiencing all of it. And yet, the narrative self is also fragile in interesting ways. People sometimes find that the story they have been telling about themselves no longer fits. A change of circumstance reveals new possibilities. A challenge reveals strengths they did not know they had. A loss reveals depths they had not yet visited. The story is constantly being revised, even when we believe it is fixed. Long before modern psychology, many philosophical and spiritual traditions thought deeply about the question of the self. Some came to surprising conclusions. The earliest Buddhist teachings, for example, contain a concept sometimes translated as not self. The idea that what we usually call the self is not a single, permanent thing, but a flowing collection of changing processes. In this view, when one looks closely at experience, one finds sensations, thoughts, feelings, perceptions, and intentions arising and passing constantly, but no single unchanging entity behind them, no little watcher sitting in the center of the mind. The self, in this view, is more like a stream than a stone, a pattern that keeps appearing, rather than a fixed thing that endures unchanged. This teaching has often been misunderstood as a denial that anything personal exists. But that was not its meaning. The early Buddhist teachers were not saying there is no person. They were saying that the person is not the kind of solid, unchanging thing it usually feels like. The everyday self is real as a process. It is just not real as a frozen essence. Many people who have meditated for long periods describe moments in which this becomes vivid experientially, not as an idea, but as a felt sense. The usual feeling of being a solid self softens. There is still experience, still seeing and hearing and breathing, but the sense of someone separate doing the experiencing becomes harder to locate. There is simply experience happening. These descriptions echo strangely with what some Western philosophers also concluded after long reflection. The Scottish philosopher David Hume, writing in the 18th century, examined his own mind carefully and reached a similar conclusion. When he looked inside, he said, he found thoughts, feelings, perceptions, and sensations, but he could never quite find a self. That was separate from these contents. The self, for Hume, was a bundle, a collection, not a single entity behind the curtain. Hume's conclusion troubled many of his contemporaries. The idea felt strange and unsettling, and yet it captured something important, something that many other thinkers in many other times had also noticed, that the self, when searched for directly, can be remarkably difficult to find. Other Western philosophers took different views. The French thinker René Descartes, writing more than a century before Hume, argued that the existence of the self was the one thing he could not doubt. He famously wrote that even if all his perceptions were deceptions, even if everything he believed were false, there had to be something doing the believing, some thinking thing, some I. From this, he concluded, in his often quoted phrase, I think, therefore I am. Descartes believed the self was a distinct thinking substance, separate from the body, a mind that observed and reasoned. Though many later philosophers questioned this division between mind and body, his argument has remained influential. The basic intuition behind it, that there is something undeniable about the fact of one's own experience, continues to feel powerful to many people. Another important Western thinker was John Locke. He argued that personal identity was primarily a matter of memory. What makes you the same person across time, he suggested, is the continuity of remembering. You are the same person tomorrow because tomorrow you will remember today. You are connected to your childhood because, at least in fragments, you can still remember it. Locke's theory raised interesting puzzles. What about the parts of life you have forgotten? Are you still the same person as the small child you no longer clearly remember being? What about people who experience severe memory loss? Do they become someone new? The question of personal identity through time has continued to occupy philosophers, with no simple answer. In more recent centuries, other thinkers have approached the question from still different angles. Some have emphasized the relational self, the idea that we become ourselves largely through our connections with others, through being seen, recognized, loved, and named. We are not solitary beings discovering ourselves alone. We are deeply social creatures whose sense of self forms in relationship. Others have emphasized the embodied self, the idea that we cannot be understood apart from our bodies, our senses, our movement through space. The self is not a ghost inside a machine. It is a living being immersed in a physical world, walking, breathing, eating, sleeping, touching surfaces, hearing sounds. The body is not a vessel that contains the self. The body is part of the self in deep and inseparable ways. The phenomenologists, philosophers who studied the structure of conscious experience, often described the self as something that emerges from being situated in the world, from having a perspective, from being here, now, looking out from this particular vantage point. The self is not so much a thing as a place from which experience is lived. And yet, for all these careful descriptions, the self remains, in some ways, a quiet mystery. It is the most familiar thing we have, and also the most difficult to define. It is the closest to us, and yet it slips away when we try to grasp it directly. Perhaps this is part of what makes the question so endlessly fascinating, even in ordinary daily experience. The self shifts in interesting ways. The self at work may feel different from the self at home. The self with old friends may feel different from the self with strangers. The self alone in the evening may feel different from the self moving through the noise of a crowded street. There are many selves, in a sense, and yet somehow they all belong to one. ongoing person. Some psychologists have described the self as a kind of conductor of an inner orchestra, coordinating different roles, different moods, different memories, allowing each to come forward when needed. The self at the funeral, the self at the celebration, the self in deep concentration, the self half asleep beside a window. All of them belong to the same person, and yet each carries a slightly different quality. Sleep itself is one of the most interesting places to consider the self. Each night, as the body relaxes and the mind softens, the usual sense of self begins to loosen. As you drift downward into the early stages of sleep, the ordinary voice of inner narration grows quieter. Thoughts become more dreamlike. The boundary between you and the rest of the world becomes softer. In deep sleep, the sense of self largely disappears for periods of time. There is no clear narrator, no clear observer. The body rests. The brain continues its quiet work. But the everyday self, the one who carries plans and worries and memories during waking life, becomes very still. And yet, you do not vanish. You return in the morning. This nightly disappearance and reappearance is one of the strangest features of being a person. Every night, the everyday self is gently set aside, and every morning it returns, picking up where it left off. The thread that connects the you of yesterday to the you of today reweaves itself across sleep, without anyone quite watching it happen. Dreams add another layer. In dreams, the self can take forms it does not take in waking life. You may find yourself in unfamiliar places, doing things you would never do, meeting people you have never met. Sometimes you may even seem to become someone else within the dream. And yet, upon waking, you still feel that the dreams belong to you, that it was you who was dreaming them, lucid dreaming, in which a person becomes aware that they are dreaming, while still inside the dream, has fascinated researchers and contemplatives alike. In a lucid dream, the dreamer may explore the world of the dream more deliberately. They may notice the strange flexibility of identity within the dream, the way one can almost feel the constructed nature of selfhood when the usual rules of waking life are suspended. Throughout history, many spiritual traditions have used the experience of dreaming as a kind of teaching about the self, suggesting that just as the dream self feels solid within the dream, but turns out to be a temporary appearance upon waking, the waking self may also be more fluid than it feels, not unreal, but not fixed either, a pattern that arises within experience rather than a permanent foundation underneath it. Meditation traditions across the world have developed careful practices for investigating the self, sitting still, following the breath, watching thoughts arise and pass without grasping at them. Over long periods, practitioners often report a gradual softening of the usual sense of being a tightly defined separate self, not its disappearance exactly, but a kind of opening into something larger and quieter. Some traditions describe this as discovering a deeper layer of identity beneath the changing surface self. In certain Hindu philosophies, this deeper level is called the Atman, the true self, often described as connected to or identical with the ultimate ground of existence. In this view, the small, everyday self is real but limited. Behind it lies something vast and unchanging. In Buddhist traditions, by contrast, the deeper investigation tends to lead away from any concept of a permanent self at all. Even at the deepest level, what one finds is described as emptiness, a kind of openness that contains all experience, but is not itself a fixed entity. These different conclusions, from contemplatives sitting quietly across thousands of years, point to how subtle the question of the self really is. What seems clear across many traditions is that careful attention to one's own mind tends to reveal that the self is not exactly what most people assume it to be. The simple, solid I that seems so obvious in everyday life turns out, on closer inspection, to be more complex, more layered, more flowing, less easy to pin down. Modern science, while approaching the question with very different methods, has reached some surprisingly compatible observations. Neuroscientists have shown that the sense of self is constructed by the brain through many different processes. There is no single self neuron, no single region where the I lives. Instead, the experience of being a unified self emerges from the cooperation of many systems working together. Studies of patients with certain neurological conditions have revealed how delicate the construction of self really is. Some people, due to brain injuries, lose the ability to recognize their own face in the mirror. Others lose the sense that parts of their body belong to them. Others experience strange shifts in their sense of personal identity. These rare cases have helped scientists understand how many different processes contribute to the everyday feeling of being someone. There are also experiments in which the sense of self can be temporarily altered through ordinary means. The rubber hand illusion, for example, is a simple setup in which a participant sits at a table with a rubber hand placed in front of them, while their own hand is hidden. When both hands are stroked at the same time, many people begin to feel that the rubber hand is theirs. The body schema, the brain's map of what belongs to the self, is more flexible than it usually feels. Other experiments have used virtual reality to give people the experience of inhabiting a body that looks quite different from their own. Some people report shifts in self-perception after even brief experiences in such virtual bodies. The mind's sense of where the self begins and ends turns out to be more pliable than most everyday life would suggest. And yet, despite all this flexibility, the sense of self is also remarkably stable in ordinary life. Most people wake up each day feeling like themselves, carrying the same name, recognizing their own reflection, remembering yesterday. The construction of the self is delicate, but the construction usually holds firm. Most of us never have occasion to notice how much quiet work the brain is doing to maintain it. Some of the most striking insights into the constructed nature of the self have come from studies of patients who have undergone a procedure called a corpus callosotomy. This is a rare surgery in which the bundle of nerve fibers connecting the two hemispheres of the brain is severed, sometimes as a treatment for severe epilepsy. After this surgery, the two halves of the brain can no longer easily communicate with one another in daily life. Most of these patients appear to function normally. They carry the same name. They recognize their families. They live their lives. But in carefully designed experiments, something remarkable can be observed. When information is presented only to one hemisphere, the other hemisphere may have no awareness of it. The two halves of the brain seem, in certain settings, to know different things, to prefer different things, to respond differently, and yet the patient still experiences themselves as a single unified person. The sense of being oneself continues, even when the underlying brain has been divided in such a fundamental way. These findings have suggested to many researchers that the unified self may be, at least in part, a kind of story the brain tells itself, a unifying narrative produced moment by moment, smoothing over the many different processes happening below the surface. The brain is constantly weaving together inputs from sight, sound, memory, emotion, and bodily sensation. And out of this weaving, the experience of being a single, coherent self continues to emerge. The sense of being located in a body also turns out to depend on quiet, ongoing work performed by the nervous system. The body schema, as researchers sometimes call it, is the brain's continuously updated map of where the body is in space, where the limbs are positioned, where the edges of the self meet the surrounding world. This map is updated countless times each second through signals coming back from the muscles, the joints, the inner ear, and the skin. When you reach for a cup without looking, when you walk in the dark without bumping into furniture, when you adjust your posture in your chair, you are relying on this constant inner sensing. It is sometimes called proprioception, the quiet sense of where the body is, without needing to see it. Many people never notice this sense at all. And yet, it is one of the foundations of the everyday experience, of being someone located somewhere. When proprioception is disturbed by injury or illness, the experience of self can shift in unsettling ways. Some patients have described the strange feeling of not quite knowing where their body is in space, of having to look at their limbs in order to be sure they are there. These rare experiences highlight just how much the ordinary sense of being a unified embodied self depends on processes that usually go entirely unnoticed. Across cultures, the question of what the self actually is has been answered in remarkably different ways. In many traditional Japanese understandings, for example, the self has often been described as something thoroughly relational. The sense of who one is shifts in significant ways depending on the situation, the company, the role being held in that moment. There is less emphasis on a single inner unchanging core and more emphasis on the patterns of relationship that give shape to a life. In many indigenous traditions around the world, the self has been understood as deeply woven into the land, the ancestors, the animals, and the living community. A person is not a separate, isolated unit. A person is a node within a vast web of relationships, stretching backward through generations and outward through every breathing thing in the surrounding world. To be a self is to belong, to remember, to be remembered. These understandings can sound unusual to ears trained in more individualistic frameworks, but they often resonate quietly with experiences that most people have had. The feeling of being held by a particular landscape, the sense of belonging that arises in the company of a long-known family, the recognition that the self is not produced in isolation, that who we are has been shaped by countless hands, voices, places, and moments we did not choose and could not have predicted. Language itself plays a much deeper role in shaping the self than is often noticed. The words available in a given language influence the kinds of distinctions a person learns to make. Different languages have different words for emotional states, different ways of speaking about time, different ways of describing relationship. Some languages emphasize the speaker. Others emphasize the listener. Some require the speaker to indicate how they came to know what they are saying. Some allow the subject of a sentence to disappear entirely. People who grow up speaking more than one language sometimes describe a quiet sense of being slightly different, selves in different languages, a different humor, a different rhythm of thinking, a different texture of feeling. The languages we live within become part of the inner architecture of selfhood. The voices we use to speak to ourselves carry their own quiet, shaping power, even the simple inner monologue. The running commentary that many people experience throughout the day is something built largely out of language. Researchers have found that not all people experience this inner voice in the same way. Some people have a nearly constant inner narration. Others experience their thinking more as images, sensations, or wordless impressions. The texture of inner life varies more widely from person to person than is often assumed. This variation suggests something quietly important. The way one experiences being a self is not a single universal thing. It differs between people. It differs between cultures. It differs between languages. It even differs within a single person across different moods, different ages, different chapters of life. The self is a flexible kind of presence, capable of many textures, capable of many forms. And throughout history, the way ordinary people have understood their own selves has shifted quietly, along with the broader culture. In some ancient periods, the inner life seems to have been described in less individualistic terms than is common today. Thoughts and feelings were sometimes attributed to gods, ancestors, or other forces beyond the personal mind. The boundary between self and world appears, in some old writings, to have been drawn quite differently than it is now. Over the long centuries, the emphasis on a clearly defined inner self has grown stronger in many parts of the world. Writing, reading, private rooms, mirrors, clocks, journals, and eventually photographs and recordings all contributed to this slow shift. Each new way of representing the self added another layer to how the self could be experienced. The self became something that could be seen, examined, described, remembered, compared, and revised in ways earlier generations could hardly have imagined. And yet, despite all of these changes, the basic mystery has remained the same. Behind every cultural form, every philosophy, every technology, the simple question continues to wait. What is the one who is asking the question? What is the one who is experiencing this particular moment? What is the quiet presence behind all the changing surfaces of a life? Beyond the laboratory and the temple, the question of the self continues to live in countless ordinary moments. In the way you recognize your own handwriting, the way certain songs make you feel like a particular age again, the way an old photograph can suddenly bring back the entire flavor of a year long past, the way you sometimes catch yourself in a window and pause for a moment, surprised by your own face. Names are another fascinating thread in the experience of selfhood. The sound of your name, said by someone who loves you, can carry an enormous weight. Names are among the first things we learn, the first signs of being recognized as a particular person. Our names are spoken thousands of times across a lifetime by parents, teachers, friends, strangers, each speaking adding another thin layer to the sense of being someone. In many traditions, names have carried even deeper significance. sacred names, secret names, names given at moments of important transition, names that change when a person enters a new phase of life. The naming of a child has been treated as a quietly important ceremony in cultures all over the world, as if the name itself helps shape the self it accompanies. Roles, too, become woven into the experience of self, being a parent, being a friend, being a teacher, a student, a healer, a builder, a listener. The roles we take on shape the way we move through the world and how we are seen by others. Some roles fit easily, others must be grown into slowly. Some are released eventually, leaving behind a residue of memory and meaning. Across a lifetime, a person plays many roles, some at once, some in different periods. The roles do not exhaust the self, but they color it. They give it texture. They give it places to express itself. And when one role ends, the person often discovers that something underneath remains, something that was not entirely the role, something quieter that goes on into the next chapter. This brings us to one of the more subtle features of selfhood, the sense of continuity across time. The feeling that the person you were 10 years ago, the person you are now, and the person you will be in 10 more years are all somehow the same person, despite all the changes, despite all the new memories and lost ones, despite the slow rewriting of personality and circumstance. When you think about your past self, the one who was a small child sitting somewhere on a summer afternoon, there is both a feeling of continuity and a feeling of distance. That was you. And yet, that was also someone you can barely picture clearly now. Their thoughts were not your thoughts. Their world was not your world. And yet, you are connected to them by an unbroken thread. That has carried you here. When you imagine your future self, 10 or 20 or 50 years from now, there is a similar mixture. That person will be you. And yet, that person will also be different. They will have lived through experiences you have not yet had. They will know things you do not know. They will, in some ways, be a stranger to your current self, and yet they will share your name. They will remember, perhaps this very night. The self across time is sometimes compared to a long thread, slowly woven by experience. Each day adds new fibers. Each year adds new colors. The thread does not stay the same, but it also does not break. It continues, gradually changing, gradually growing, gradually becoming whatever it is becoming. Some philosophers have suggested that the relationship between your present self and your future self is, in certain ways, similar to your relationship with a close family member. You care about them. You make plans for them. You try to provide for them, but they are not exactly you in the simplest sense. They are someone connected to you, traveling forward in time, inheriting the consequences of your present choices. This way of thinking can be strangely freeing. It does not make the future less important. It does not make the connection less real, but it can soften the grip of certain kinds of worry. The future self will face their challenges with their own resources. You cannot live their life for them. You can only offer them whatever you are able to offer. From where you are now, looking backward, similar reflections can soften the weight of certain memories. The person who made certain mistakes long ago was you, in some sense, but they were also someone with less knowledge than you now have, less experience, less perspective, compassion for one's earlier self, the kind one might naturally feel for someone learning slowly, can be a quiet gift of growing older. The self, then, can be thought of in many ways as a body, as a stream of memories, as a personality, as a brain, as a narrative, as a relational being, as a role, as a thread through time, as a process that arises and passes within ever-shifting experience. None of these descriptions alone captures the whole. Each captures something. Together, they begin to outline how strange and beautiful the question really is, and perhaps the fact that the self resists simple definition is part of what makes the question so quietly meaningful. The self is not a problem to be solved once and for all. It is a presence to be lived with, to be observed, to be cared for, to be wondered about gently across a lifetime, even today, in laboratories around the world. Scientists continue investigating how the brain produces the experience of being someone. New imaging techniques allow researchers to watch the patterns of brain activity that arise when a person thinks about themselves, or recalls a memory, or imagines the future. Each study reveals something. None of them quite explains everything. And in quiet rooms across the world, people continue sitting in meditation, watching their own minds, practicing the long discipline of attention, noticing how thoughts arise, how feelings move through the body, how the sense of being a separate self can come and go like clouds passing across the sky, in poetry, in philosophy, in songs, in conversations late at night between friends. The question continues being asked, what am I? What is the I that asks this question? Where does it come from? Where does it go when I sleep? What happens to it across the long arc of a life? These questions do not need final answers in order to be worth asking. The asking itself softens the mind. It opens space. It invites a kind of gentle wonder. The recognition that the most familiar thing in our experience is also, in some ways, the most mysterious. And perhaps tonight, as you rest, the question can be allowed to settle gently into the background, not as a problem to be solved, just as a quiet companion, the self that has carried you through this day, the self that has thought countless thoughts since the morning, the self that is now beginning to slow, to loosen, to let go. There are countless moments in a single day when the self appears and disappears in subtle ways, when you become absorbed in a piece of music. The sense of being a separate listener often softens. There is just the music when you are deeply engaged in a task. The self-conscious watching can recede. There is just the doing. When you laugh with someone you love, the boundary between you and them can feel thinner than usual. There is just the shared moment. Psychologists sometimes use the word flow to describe these states. The sense of being fully absorbed, the losing of self-consciousness, time slowing or speeding up, the doing happening on its own. Athletes describe it. Musicians describe it. Writers describe it. Anyone who has ever been deeply caught up in something has tasted it, even briefly. What is interesting about these states is that the self does not exactly disappear. It softens. It moves into the background. And yet, experience continues vividly. Perhaps even more vividly than usual. This suggests something important, that the constant maintenance of a strong sense of separate self is not necessary for experience itself, the experiencing continues. The narration just grows quieter. Many of the most cherished moments of human life seem to involve this softening, watching a sunset slowly fade, holding a sleeping child, walking alone through falling snow, sitting beside an old friend without speaking. In such moments, the everyday machinery of self-thinking often slows. There is more room, more presence, more peace. Artists and craftspeople across many traditions have described something similar in their work. Painters who spend hours at the easel sometimes describe a state in which the painting almost seems to be making itself. The decisions arrive on their own. The hand moves without needing instruction. Musicians describe long passages in which the performance flows through them, without the usual self-monitoring. Woodworkers, weavers, potters, dancers, gardeners all describe versions of this quiet absorption. In such states, the self does not vanish. The work still belongs to the person doing it. The skill still comes from years of patient practice. But the loud sense of being a separate self, watching oneself work, grows softer. The doer and the doing become more closely woven, and out of this weaving, work of a quieter and often deeper quality often emerges. This may help explain why so many people turn to creative practice not only for its outward results, but for the inward experience it offers. Time spent in the quiet absorption of making something can feel restorative in a way that other activities do not. The mind grows still. The body grows attentive. The self loosens its tight grip on itself. And in this loosening, something gentle is allowed to happen. The same softening can arrive in simpler ways too. The careful washing of a single dish, the slow folding of warm laundry, the unhurried preparation of a cup of tea, the patient watering of a few houseplants. Tasks that seem small from the outside can become quietly spacious when entered into with full attention. The self that performs them becomes a little less burdened, a little more present, a little more at ease. And perhaps this is part of why people across cultures have so often described the deepest happiness as quiet rather than loud. Not because nothing is happening, but because so much is happening, and the self is no longer standing in its own way. The water flows more easily when the river does not work so hard to hold its own shape. This may also be part of what makes sleep itself so restorative, the nightly release of the everyday self into something larger and softer. The body breathes on its own. The brain continues its quiet work, sorting memories, repairing tissues, dreaming whatever dreams it dreams. The constant inner voice of waking life gives way to silence. The self rests, and in resting, returns refreshed. Some traditions have suggested that the brief experience of falling asleep each night can be a quiet teacher, a nightly reminder that the everyday self is not the entire story, that there is something underneath, something prior, something that holds the self gently and lets it go each evening, without complaint, without loss, only rest, only return. The deeper one looks at the question of the self, the more it seems to point not to a thing, but to a process, not to a possession, but to a movement. The self is not so much something you have as something you do, continuously, without thinking about it. The way a flame is not really a thing, but a process of burning. The way a wave is not really a thing, but a process of water moving. This way of seeing can change the texture of certain worries. If the self is a process, then certain kinds of self-protection begin to seem strange. You do not have to defend a process the way you defend a possession. You only have to participate in it, to attend to it, to let it continue its quiet unfolding. It can also change the way we relate to other people. If their selves, like ours, are processes rather than possessions, then we are all involved in this great, quiet activity together. Each person a slow, flowing pattern, each one connected to others through countless invisible threads, selves shaping selves, selves softening selves, selves rising and resting across the long centuries. Perhaps this is why love so often feels related to the question of the self, because in love, the boundary of self softens in a particular way. The well-being of another becomes interwoven with one's own. Joy in their joy, sorrow in their sorrow. The self extends in some way beyond its usual edges. And this extension is often experienced not as loss, but as expansion, as a deeper kind of being. The relational self, the self woven out of connections, has been emphasized by many philosophers in recent times. The Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, for example, wrote about the difference between treating others as objects to be used and meeting them as fellow beings to be known. In the second kind of encounter, he suggested, the self becomes more fully itself, as if our deepest selfhood arises in meeting, not in isolation. Similar ideas appear in many traditions. African philosophies have long emphasized the idea sometimes summarized. As I am, because we are, the recognition that the self is woven into community. That personhood is something that arises through relationship, through belonging, through the long mutual shaping of lives lived together. This stands in interesting contrast to certain modern Western emphasis on the self as an individual achievement, as something earned through effort, as something owned. There is truth in that picture too, but it is not the whole picture. The self is also a gift, continuously received from others, continuously offered back, continuously remade in the quiet exchanges of daily life. A baby learns to smile, in part, by being smiled at, learns to soothe themselves, in part, by being soothed, learns to speak by being spoken to, learns to love by being loved. The early self is built almost entirely out of the materials of relationship, and throughout life, the self continues drawing on those materials. The voices of those who loved us, the hands that taught us, the patience that was extended to us when we needed it. When those relationships are healthy, the self that grows from them tends to feel relatively solid and at ease. When they are not, the self that grows from them often has to work much harder to find its footing. Healing, for many people, becomes partly a matter of receiving, late in life, the kinds of attention they did not receive early, through good friendships, through therapy, through community, through learning to give to themselves what was once missing. These reflections suggest that the self is not a fortress to be defended. It is more like a garden to be tended, watered by relationship, nourished by attention, shaped slowly by what is allowed in and what is not, pruned occasionally, allowed to bloom, allowed to rest in winter, tended without rush, and, as in any garden, much of the work happens quietly, beneath the surface, The roots grow without being seen. The transformations of one season set the stage for the next. The gardener cannot force the flowering. They can only create the conditions and wait. The self, too, often grows in this slow, hidden way, with seasons of visible change and seasons of quiet preparation. There are seasons of selfhood, just as there are seasons of weather, times when the self feels strong and clear, times when it feels confused or tired, times of being recognized by others, times of being misunderstood, times of feeling deeply at home, times of feeling lost. Each season belongs to the long life of the self. None of them is the whole story. In old age, many people describe a softening of the urgent need to defend the self. The opinions that once seemed so important grow less sharp. The judgments grow gentler. The need to prove things to others diminishes. What remains is often a quieter form of selfhood, more patient, more attentive to small things, more at ease with the changing weather of the inner world. This is not always how things go. Of course, some people grow more rigid with age, not less. Some grow more fearful. Some grow more solitary. But the pattern of softening is common enough that it has been described in many cultures, as if the long work of being a self eventually leads, for many, to a quiet loosening, a willingness to let some things go, a readiness to rest through all of these reflections. One thing keeps returning: the self, however we describe it, is something deeply familiar. We do not have to study it in order to encounter it. It is already with us, in every breath, in every quiet thought, in every glance into a mirror, in every moment of waking and falling asleep. The question is not whether we have a self. The question is what kind of relationship we have with the one we already are. To be at peace with one's own self is one of the quieter gifts of a life. Not perfect peace, not constant peace, but a basic underlying friendliness toward the being one happens to be. A willingness to live alongside oneself with patience, with humor, with kindness, to allow the self to be exactly the self it is, while also allowing it to grow. There are many practices that traditions have developed to encourage this kind of friendliness. Some involve formal meditation. Some involve simple daily habits of reflection. Some involve writing. Some involve walking quietly. Some involve speaking with trusted others. Some involve nothing more than allowing oneself moments of stillness throughout the day. In those moments of stillness, the self often shows itself most clearly, not by announcing itself, but by quieting, by the simple fact of being there, without distraction, without performance, the self resting in its own presence, not asking anything of itself, just being, and in the rhythm of a day, such moments may be brief. A pause beside a window, a breath taken before answering a difficult question, a few seconds of looking up at the sky, a minute of warm water against the hands. Before continuing with the work of the day, these small pauses can add up, slowly, into a different kind of relationship with oneself. For tonight, perhaps it is enough to remember that the self you are now has carried you faithfully through this day. It rose with you in the morning. It moved through the small tasks and conversations. It carried whatever weights needed carrying. It noticed whatever beauty crossed its path. And now it is preparing with you for rest. The self that you are tonight is not exactly the self that you were last year. It is not exactly the self that you will be a year from now, but it is the one that is here. The one that has walked all this way, the one that has earned, by simply continuing, the right to rest. You do not have to define yourself in order to sleep. You do not have to solve the puzzle of who you are. The self continues whether or not you understand it, like the breath, which continues without your conscious help, like the heart, which beats without being told. The self quietly continues, holding everything together, asking very little, simply being who it is, and in this, letting go, this allowing of the self to simply be. Something soft begins to settle. The mind grows quieter. The body grows heavier. The day's small worries begin to loosen their grip. The thread of inner narration slows. There is more room, more silence, more gentle presence, out beyond the question of the self. The world continues its quiet movement. Stars turning slowly overhead, trees swaying gently in the night wind, rivers continuing their unhurried way toward the sea. The earth itself rotating quietly through its long orbit. All of it continuing without needing to be defined, all of it simply being what it is, and within you, the same quiet continuation is happening. The breath rising and falling, the heart beating, the cells doing their patient work, the mind slowly letting the day go, the self resting into the larger life that holds it, unhurried, unworried, simply at home in this moment. The mystery of the self is not something to be feared. It is something to be allowed, like a deep pool of water in a quiet forest. You do not have to understand all the way to the bottom of it in order to sit beside it. You can simply sit, letting the surface reflect the sky, letting the depths remain as they are, allowing the mystery to be exactly itself. And perhaps tonight, the mystery is simply this, that you are here, that something in you is listening, that something in you has carried you across all the years to this very moment, that something will continue carrying you into the quiet hours of the night, into the morning that follows, into all the days that remain to be lived. You do not have to do anything more right now. The self knows how to rest. The body knows how to soften. The mind knows how to let go. Each part of you carries a quiet wisdom about how to settle into the night. All you have to do is allow it, to let the days holding loosen, to let the breath slow, to let the gentle weight of sleep arrive in its own time. Some of the oldest writings in human history have described the experience of falling asleep as a kind of small homecoming, a return to a deeper place beneath the busy self of the day, a place where the small worries cannot reach, a place that has been there all along, waiting for you beneath the surface of your thinking. In that place, the questions about the self can rest with everything else. They will still be there in the morning if you wish to take them up again. They will still be interesting. They will still be quietly mysterious. But for now, they can soften. They can become part of the gentle background, like distant music, like rain at the edge of hearing. The self that has carried you is also the self that knows how to be carried by the night, by the bed beneath you, by the slow tide of sleep. There is nothing to hold tightly, nothing to defend, nothing to prove, only the slow, gentle settling of a long day into its natural close. If thoughts arise, they may be allowed to arise and pass without being followed, without being argued with, like leaves drifting on the surface of slow water. They appear, they drift, they are gone. The water continues its quiet flowing beneath them. The self continues its quiet being beneath the thoughts. And out beyond all definitions, all theories, all words, the simple fact remains. You are here, breathing, listening, slowly drifting. The mystery of who you are continues quietly along with you, not above you, not below you, just with you, as it has always been. The night moves slowly outward. The world settles into its long, quiet hours. Somewhere, far away, rain may be falling on a roof. Somewhere, an old tree may be moving softly in the night wind. Somewhere, a candle may be burning low in a quiet room. All of these continuing gently, without requiring anything of you. And here, in this moment, the breath continues. The heart continues. The body continues its long, patient work. And the self, that strange and familiar presence, continues quietly along, not as a thing to be solved, just as the one who has carried you here, the one who is ready now for rest. There is no rush, no final understanding required, only the quiet permission to let everything settle, to let the day soften, to let the mind grow still, to let the body sink deeper into the soft weight of the bed, to let the breath find its slow nighttime rhythm, to let the self rest in whatever it is. And as the night deepens, the questions grow quieter, the thoughts grow fewer. The space between thoughts grows wider. Sleep moves closer. The mind becomes a gentle drifting. The self becomes a soft presence, aware, calm, letting go. Far away, the moon may be moving across the sky. Far away, the rivers continue toward the sea. Far away, the stars continue their slow turning. And here, you continue too, breathing, resting, beginning to drift. The day finished, the night gathering you in. The thoughts soften, the body softens, the light behind the eyes softens. The self that wondered about itself begins to let the wondering go. There is only the breath, only the gentle weight, only the quiet. A slow inhale, a slow exhale, the mind growing still, the body growing heavy, the night holding everything gently. Nothing more to do, nothing more to think, only the slow drift towards sleep. Sleep moving closer, like soft tide arriving at a quiet shore, the mind quieter, the body heavier, the breath slower, the self resting in its own quiet presence. The questions can wait. The day is done. The night is here. There is only this, the slow breath, the quiet body, the gentle drift, the soft letting go, slow breath, quiet mind, soft weight, gentle drift, letting go, resting, sleeping, quiet, still, here, quiet, rest.